Testing 1, 2. I'm a little bit inappropriate to be next to the monitor.
You're a little boss.
I'm inappropriate to be next to the monitor. It should be the stars of the show.
No, I think it's going to be better on there because I can see everyone.
Okay.
Yeah. It's the old musketeers. The BRD. Since 30 years ago.
Thank
I couldn't look at it. I think it was I think it must have been a bucket sometime. Yeah, I can get it anywhere on the tube. It didn't stop me. I had a pretty difficult journey home, but that night, but again, I was lucky working for it. It was wonderful. It was, beyond good. And it's so thoughtful about it. So analytical, explaining complicated things in such a clear way.
He is really good. I mean, he's
Good evening, everyone. It's so nice to see such a big audience. I think probably even some of my students who are here in the middle of an exam period. So nice to see. I see a few of you out there. But welcome to everyone. My name is Catherine Hostetler. I'm a professor of international development and the head of the Department of International Development here at the LSE. I'm pleased to welcome all of you, those of you in the room and those of you joining us online. Welcome all of you to today's panel discussion of the MDBs, the Multilateral Development Banks, and possibilities for reform and change in these banks. This is an event jointly organized by the LSE Department for International Development, by LSE's Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, and the Global Affairs think tank Overseas Development Institute. This is a public event following a day-long symposium. Others of you in the room were there also, with nearly 150 participants in London and online, which convened academics, think tank, staff, government officials, and civil society organizations. So a few housekeeping details for those in the room. Please make sure your phones are turned off. The fire assembly point is at the corner of Lincoln's Inn Fields. Those in the room will have the opportunity to, in the final part of the session, to ask questions, and all are invited to a reception afterwards. Those participating online may also ask questions through the YouTube channel's chat function. We encourage you to tweet and post about the event on social media using the hashtag LSE Reform MDBs. The event is being recorded. So turning to the topic of this evening's event, the finance and policies of multilateral development banks, or the MDBs, gained center stage in 2022 in the debates on financing for sustainable development. The growing calls for MDB reform have come from all sides, from the G7 countries, from the borrowing countries, and from civil society. Attention to the MDB reform agenda is remaining high in 2023. There's a number of things going on that are really putting MDB reform at the top of the global agenda this year. There's the World Bank Group's evolution roadmap. There's an independent expert group on MDB reform that's been mandated by the G20 presidency, which India holds this year. And then next month in Paris, there's going to be a summit for a new global financial pact, which will be trying to mobilize finance for climate change and other ongoing and future crises in the global south. So it really is a very important and timely topic that we have here. Ahead of June's finance summit in particular, we couldn't have a better, more distinguished panel to talk about these issues. All our leaders of the hosting institutions, expert in the topics tonight, and will be introduced by our moderator. So the last thing for me to do is to introduce the moderator. Our moderator this evening is Henry Kerr. Henry has led the Economist's economics coverage since 2018. And if you're keeping track, that means through the pandemic, the return of inflation, the energy crisis, and the American banking crisis, and many more things. So we're in very good hands tonight. This is well within his skill set. So over to you, Henry.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks for that welcome, Catherine. As Catherine said, my name is Henry Kerr. I'm the economics editor at The Economist magazine, and it's great to be at this event co-hosted by the LSE and the ODI. It's always good when The Economist and the LSE get together. We're close neighbours. For a while, we had a bookshop, although I think sadly that closed down a few years ago. And I learned recently that a little over a century ago, the LSE faculty provided one of our most important editors, Francis Hurst, who led the newspaper during the golden age of liberalism in the early 20th century in the UK, and played a key role in selling the principles behind liberal reform to the city. So that's good. Unfortunately, Hurst was also described as a true fanatic and later sacked. So I'm hoping our collaboration this evening, for my sake, does not end the same way. I'm sure it won't. I'm sure we're not going to see too much fanaticism from our speakers tonight. Instead, what you can expect is some real insight owing to their quality and experience. So let me introduce them. In the centre, we have Baroness Manoush Shafiq, who is President and Vice Chancellor of the LSE and is soon to move across the Atlantic to become the President of Columbia University. Manoush has held a large number of senior policymaking positions in her career at the Bank of England, DFID, the IMF, and the World Bank. We have Lord Nicholas Stern, who at the LSE is the I.G. Patel Professor of Economics and Government, Chairman of the Grantham Research Institute and Head of the India Observatory. Nick too has vast experience at the Summit of Policymaking, including as Chief Economist of the World Bank. From the ODI, we have three representatives. So on Manoush's immediate left, we have Sara Pantoliano, who's the Chief Executive of the ODI and has held several positions at the UN, where she's currently chair of the 7th Advisory Group of the UN Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund. To my immediate left, we have Chris Humphrey, who's a Senior Research Associate at the ODI and the author of a recent book, Financing the Future, Multilateral Development Banks in the Changing World Order of the 21st Century. So very well suited tonight. And then on the far left here, your right, we have Annalisa Prison, who is Principal Research Fellow at the ODI and a member of the UN Committee for Development Policy. And her main research focus has been on the multilateral development banks, which are, of course, the subject of our discussion tonight. MDBs, of course, being an umbrella term, which pairs the World Bank with regional development banks, such as the Asian Development Bank. And these institutions play a unique role in development, with their fundamental purpose being to provide development finance at better terms than the capital markets, while also providing advice and expertise. And as we were just hearing, there's a lot of debate about the future of these institutions, whether they're controlled by the right people, whether they're pursuing the right goals, whether they're well suited to the challenges we face. There's new leadership at the World Bank. There's the Paris Summit next month. So it's really a hot topic. And the question everyone is asking is what needs to change? So my first question for the panel is, if you were to prioritize one area of MDB reform, what would that be and why? And Manoush, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, if I had to pick one, it would be quota and governance reform, because there is a very real risk of fragmentation in the multilateral system today because of geopolitics. And unless these institutions find a way to keep everyone in by fairly representing their roles in the world economy, I think we will lose that aspect of global governance. And I think one of the reasons these institutions have been historically effective, frankly, a little more effective than the UN, is because of their governance. So instead of having a one country, one vote system, which could be legitimate for some decisions, these institutions have governance in which voting is supposed to be linked to the side, your importance in the world economy. And that has enabled these institutions to actually deliver and do things. And the more misaligned their governance is with the reality of the world economy, the less effective they'll be.
Do you think it's reasonable in this era of geopolitical conflict between the US and China to expect the US and the West, which control these institutions, to voluntarily give up the power they have?
Well, I think the trade-off is between relevance and effectiveness. So you choose effectiveness or you choose irrelevance. And I think that's the case that has to be put before those shareholders.
Okay, so from Manoush, we have the levers of control at these institutions. Nick, what do you think is the most important reform that needs to happen at the MDBs?
I think you have to start the question of reform from what it is that we have to do. And we now have to multiply the flows of finance from the multilateral development banks as a system by a factor of around 3 in the next 5 years. And that's deductive. That's starting with what kinds of investments are necessary to tackle climate in terms of energy systems and adaptation and resilience, loss and damage and natural capital. What kinds of investments are necessary for the SDGs? A few of you are supporting the SDG badge here, I can see. So you have to start a question of reform with the purpose. And the purpose is to finance those major changes that we have to make. If we fail to make those changes, we're in deep, deep trouble. So you get that we need to expand the system by a factor of 3, and that the flows, but this is by 2030, that all the numbers are in the Songway-Stern-Bhattacharya report, if you want to check it out. And you have to greatly increase the working together with the private sector to multiply, as it were, every dollar of MDB funding should go with $3-4 of private sector money. And the way in which they come together, of course, is important. So I would start the question of reform with what is the purpose? And then I would ask the question, what is it we have to do to deliver on that purpose? We have to multiply their flows by 3. We have to work much better with the private sector. And then you ask the question, what do you need in terms of the reform of those institutions to get there? But I would not start the question with what are your reforms? What is it you have to do? And then what reforms do you need to get there? Where probably for the reasons that you just described about relationships between the US and China, you're probably going to have an expansion of some of the particular windows, like the Global Infrastructure Facility, Global Environment Facility, rather than, in the case of the World Bank, just straight capital increase. With other places, it's more straightforward to do straight capital increases. So that's what I do. Start with a purpose, what's necessary in terms of financing to get there, and then what kind of reforms can facilitate that, given these complicated political constraints that we have. And my worry is that if you just talk about reforms, then people sit back and they take years, and they'll get some consultancy to come along and have a look. We're in a hurry. We've really got to get these investments going in the next few years. We haven't got the time to lose.
So massive investment need, and you work backwards to what reforms are necessary to get there. Okay, so that's Nick's answer.
It's not ambitious, it's necessary. Yeah.
Well, it can be necessary and ambitious, can't it?
Well, it depends. I mean, it's not that you're an enthusiasm and you're impatient and all that. Well, maybe some of us are, but this is actually asking the question, what do we need to do to deliver on the objectives we have already set for ourselves? So, that's delivery of a target that's already been set, and set for very good reason of what the consequences of failure are.
I see. So we're already committed to the ambition, and we should follow through. Sarah, I'm going to turn to you now. This will be the last question on what the top priority is, or we're going to run out of them. But what do you think the top priority is for MDB reform?
I actually agree with Manoush. It is governance, but because you've already talked about it, I'll bring another one. It is about changing the way of operating of banks to be able to serve the countries, the borrowers, those
those that were created for in a better way. And that to me needs, first of all, a completely different level of risk appetite. There is just too much risk aversion and very poor definition of risk, actually, in my view, and very different parameters across the various MDBs and a consistent strength that actually brings them together, which means that in some of the countries, the ones I'm most familiar with, which is the conflict affected ones and the more fragile ones, it's almost impossible, to operate because you have very inflexible bureaucracy and very, high degree of risk aversion to operate in those contexts. And those are some of the countries that need the support of the MDBs the most. Otherwise, they could just go to any bank.
So could you expand on that a little bit more? The bureaucracy and the lack of risk appetite inhibits the operation of these institutions in countries that are fragile. So, I mean, that sounds like quite a fundamental issue if you're, going into somewhere that's ravaged by war or something. So how do you overcome that?
So there are a lot of things that could be done to operate more flexibly, and a lot of I can give you an example from a country that I know very well and where I've worked for a long time, which is South Sudan. South Sudan, after independence, this is a country that was at war for 21 years, and the instrument to try and support the transition in South Sudan that was created was the Multi-Donor Trust Fund that was managed by the bank. I would have challenged the most seasoned of governments to engage with the rules and regulations of the Multi-Donor Trust Funds. It was so complex, so bureaucratic. It was a level of complexity that was impossible for a set of, sort of basically freedom fighters that were coming out of 21 years in the bush, to engage with. Obviously, all in a language that was not familiar to them and in a currency that was not theirs. There are ways, to make rules tailored to the countries in which they're operating. And quite frankly, it's not a problem just for, conflict-affected countries or, so-called fragile countries. I think that is a more general challenge for a lot of the borrowers to find the procedures and, the structures and the strictures of MDBs, in particular the World Bank, are really, really difficult to navigate and engage with.
Okay.
I could even follow up.
Yeah,
on that
please do.
if that's okay.
Yeah.
Just to sort of connect these 2 points of governance and the problems that MDBs have in dealing with the borrowers. I think a lot of the non-borrower shareholders who control these major MDBs have been very prone to wanting to put on all sorts of restrictions just so they can avoid any risks and not have to worry about it at all. And I don't think they're fully aware of what they're doing to these MDBs and how that is impacting the ability and desire of borrowers to engage with them. And some borrowers are simply voting with their feet and going elsewhere, even though it might be at a higher cost and it might not have the same kind of developmental impact. So there is a direct link between the governance, frankly, domination of a lot of the Western countries, the non-borrower countries, and the way these banks operate. And I think we need to see that connection and not try to pose it as simply a little technical tweak that we can fix. It all relates to the governance dimension.
And Annalisa, of course, your work is on looking at what precisely it is that borrowing countries want from the World Bank. So perhaps you can come in on that and tell us what it is.
Let me just kind of start with a kind of a first point. MDBs are part of the kind of broader system of development finance and are kind of a smaller kind of part of the system. But they do offer a kind of, I'd say, quite a unique combination of relatively cheap finance, or at least better than market rates. The projects do come with advice on how to implement them, on how to actually provide policy advice on change, for reform, and also they have very strong convening power and knowledge. So it's a kind of a very unique combination around that. And when we started kind of working on MDB policies and finances, I remember the assumption that MDBs were relevant wasn't really there. There were a number of middle-income countries. I was talking with finance ministries, actually. They were telling me, well, actually, I don't want to borrow with the MDBs because it's too complicated. We talk about a little bit around the challenges and the procurement system, the safeguarding, and it wasn't really worth it any longer. So I came back to that kind of question and I asked government officials whether they thought actually the MDBs are still relevant. And actually 4 out of 5 government officials, we talked about with nearly 500. So I think that's a really good kind of sample around that. They told us actually what the MDBs offer is relevant for them. And most importantly, they rate them as very effective institutions with differences. We can talk about that. But there's a very important point. The institutions do matter for the client countries, but there are a number of kind of challenges borrowing countries face, and I'm happy to elaborate later on, but it goes back to the fact that the MDBs are not necessarily that flexible. They find, I mean, particularly procurement safeguarding rules as quite complex, difficult to navigate. They have to be there, but they create, so to speak, if I can use the expression, a hassle factor, and that deters them from taking up loans. And again, it's very important. I do agree with Nika. We need to kind of scale up resources massively, but we need to make sure that actually the conditions are there for countries to take up loans and actually to have some absorptive capacity. If I use a technical term, they are able actually to implement projects in the short to medium term.
Yeah, could I just pick up on that? That Annalise's point is crucial. And I hope you can keep reminding yourself of the importance of agency and scale, because so often in these discussions, you talk about the urgency and scale at the beginning, and you explain why we have to do it in that time. And then people nod and say, yes, of course. And then the conversation goes on as if there's no question and that we can take our time to sort all these things out, which we cannot. But in that spirit, first and foremost, you have to create the conditions in which this big increase in investment can occur. And that's, if you like, the language of the country and sector platform, where the country has to make up its mind what kinds of investments it's going to need for restructuring its energy sector, for water, for land, and so on, and how it's going to create conditions for private sector investment. And that's something that it, in many cases, can find good partners in the MDBs. And first and foremost, the MDBs have to work with countries to create those country and sector platforms, in part what we used to call the investment climate when I was working at the EBRD with my two very distinguished colleagues over here on the right. And that is a fundamental role for the MDBs. And one thing that irritates the hell out of me when you talk to some MDBs is saying, look, it's not a question of finance, the projects aren't there. But you just want to pick them up by the lapels and say, why aren't the things there? Well, because you haven't done your job in supporting countries in order to create the conditions for investments through country and sector platforms. And that's logically prior to the way in which you finance those projects. Of course, it's chicken and egg. Unless people think that the finance is going to be there, they won't be so energetic in creating the conditions for the investment. But that's a fundamentally important role for the MDBs and for the MDBs working as a group, because you don't want, you don't want 15 different perspectives all competing with each other in creating country and sector platforms. Coherence there is extremely important.
Manisha, I saw you smiling and nodding there. Does that resonate for you, that observation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very different world for policymakers in developing countries, say, than when I first started. When I first started in 1990 at the World Bank, the World Bank was essentially a monopolist. It was the major provider of development finance. It had the most analytical capacity. It was so much larger. It was larger than all the regional development banks combined. And developing countries had very little choice about where to go. I think in today's world, they have obviously private financial markets, proliferation of development finance organizations. The other MDBs have got bigger. And there's no more monopoly of knowledge, and development knowledge is widely, there's a huge market for consulting firms, academics, think tanks, et cetera, et cetera. And so the challenge, I think, for developing countries today is to figure out how to make the system work for them and which projects they want financed by the World Bank versus the private markets, and optimizing that for themselves. And I think the other thing that makes me a little bit hopeful is that, development policymakers in developing countries all went to places like the LSE and have skills and the capacity. I mean, there are exceptions. Fragile states, I think, are different, but their capacity is completely different than it used to be 30, 40 years ago. So it's a very different world. And I think the question really is, how do we make this much more complicated development finance landscape work for countries?
Yeah, just want to add something. I mean, I agree with you, Nick, that there's a bit of almost an excuse around this pipeline of projects that is not out there. And I hear that all the time. But even where the pipeline is there, we don't see the investment. And it goes back to the issue of risk. And often, senior officials blame the shareholders. But I am more and more convinced that actually it is, their own I think risk around their careers that holds back, certain investments. As I think a senior colleague has sort of told me in the room, deals of fail is what is remembered when you come to promotion, rather than, the appetite to try and incentivize, certain investment that could be very transformative.
And it has to be the shareholders and the leadership of the banks that give that authorizing environment for people to be creative, because it's not, do you go to the private sector or do you go to the development bank? You have to go to them both in most cases, because the private sector won't go on their own.
Exactly.
They have to have ways of managing, reducing, sharing the risk. So the skill of the modern development banker in an MDB should be right there, around how you work with the private sector to create the conditions for investment, and the country of concern, of course, to create the conditions for investment, and then how you bring those different forms of finance together to share and cover the risk. And the MDBs can do guarantees, and they should do much more. They can do equity, and they should do much more. Again, some of these questions you should ask those two fellows over there, because Hans-Peter Lankes and Josue Tanaka, built a really great machine at the EBRD to tackle these kinds of, but I had the privilege of working with them, and to really put together these different elements. And so the skill of the banker was around these combinations of different sources of finance to handle different sorts of risk, where the people who were better able to take this risk took it, and the people better able to take that risk took it. And I think those skills do exist in some places, but they don't exist to anything like the right extent through the MDBs, and they have to acquire them fairly quickly. Yeah.
I mean, if I can jump in, I mean, there are several countries that have a clear pipeline of projects. They have green books, blue books, where you have a long list of projects. I have several colleagues who used to be ODI fellows that might have seen those kind of books around. And you have a very clear list of projects, and you have the country in the driving seat. They tell which MDB to work on, or when MDBs have to come together. Then the question is that when this kind of clear strategy is not there, what do we do? I mean, that's the key question. Could it be a kind of an instrument? I mean, again, we're talking about climate, particularly the climate and development country reports of the World Bank. They're really good analytical reports, but could they be a kind of a driver, a vehicle actually to help the country develop a strategy and then a kind of a pipeline? I think the kind of key challenge is to move from an analytical report, and also the bank has systematic country diagnosis, very good reports, then they didn't translate into the country programming. Can we use the country climate and development reports as a kind of a way to help a Ministry of Finance or line agencies to develop their own strategy and pipeline?
Manish.
Well, someone has to make the IMF point, which is that, at the moment, many low and middle income countries are in serious debt distress.
Yeah.
And so the issue isn't really, can they take, where's more development debt they can take on? The real problem is they're already over indebted. And, we've just come through this period of very low interest rates in which many, particularly middle income countries, had access to financial markets and were able to borrow at very, very low rates. And much of that financing has dried up and has gotten much more expensive. So I think we have to think about this huge development finance challenge, whether it's for climate or for delivering the sustainable development goals, alongside thinking, how are we going to solve this debt problem?
And seeing as you have brought that up, I'm going to ask the dreaded geopolitics question again here, because of course, the US-China relationship is standing in the way of some of these debt restructurings. We've had some progress on Ghana this week. How confident are you that China can cooperate in these debt restructurings in the way that's necessary to unlock the IMF support?
So the problem used to be coordinating private creditors. And that's what the IMF had to do. Today, the problem is coordinating official creditors. And as you know, China is not a member of the Paris Club, it's an observer. But, you know, the IMF actually has a policy called lending into arrears. I don't want to get too nerdy here, but the lending into arrears policy means the IMF can help a country deal with its debt and lend into a crisis situation, even if all creditors are not agreed. And what lending into arrears means basically is that you finance your debt by not repaying some of those creditors. And they've done it with private sector creditors, but they also can do it with official creditors. And I think at some point, you know, if you can't bring all creditors to the table, I think the IMF needs to assert its lending into arrears policy.
Doesn't that run up slightly against the multilateralism point you opened with, though? Because that essentially turns these institutions into institutions which are more aligned with the West, doesn't it?
Well, I think if they apply that policy in an even-handed manner, that is the key, and that it applies in all situations where you have recalcitrant creditors who won't come to the table, then I think it's consistent. And in some ways, that's the whole point of these institutions, is that they apply rules in a consistent manner across all countries.
Could I just follow up on that? Because, you know, I've been working in China for more than 35 years now. And there's this kind of sort of block view amongst many, particularly United States, of, you know, China is irretrievably recalcitrant, stuck in its ways. And, you know, they live in the real world. They're very pragmatic. And if loans are unsustainable, in other words, your debt position is such that you cannot service your debt, then if cannot means cannot, then you won't service your debt. So something has to happen. Yeah. And China has been very loath to actually write things off. Yeah? They've been very loath to write things off, particularly in conditions where they think that other people might make off with the money and not write things off themselves. But they're flexible.
Sorry, that's other people being the World Bank.
Well, private sector, possibly some other institutions.
But they have also.
And the MDBs.
Yes, exactly.
And of course, the MDBs have the preferred creditor status, that ultimately they stand better than anybody else. But what China has been doing, and they're not with any sort of great fanfare, is that they reschedule, they roll over. Well, you know, if you roll over a debt in that kind of circumstance, essentially the capital value of that debt has gone down. Yeah. So there is a flexibility there. And I think what Minusha said, you know, if the IMF starts lending into arrears, China sees other people coming in, I think it changes the terms of the debate.
Can I? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you go ahead.
No, I just want to underscore
I
the point.
agree with Annalisa about the CCDRs, the climate change and development reviews. We might come back to that because it's a very important point.
I just want to underscore a point I think is really, really fundamental, because there's been such a demonization of China, especially around the debt issues, that is so deeply unhelpful. And that's not the perspective of a lot of borrower countries who actually see the flexibility that China is exercising, or at least not a much greater inflexibility than Western sort of lenders, if you will. Yeah. And so I think it's really important, if you want to really find a multilateral approach that brings everyone together, that we stop demonizing China to the extent that we've done so far.
But that also brings us back to governance. Part of the reason they're demanding that the World Bank take haircuts is because they don't feel enough ownership of the institution. And if they felt greater ownership and had a greater voice in it, they might not take that position. Yeah.
It's one of the reasons that they worked to establish the new development bank, so-called BRICS Bank, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And some of us were directly involved in the establishment of those. And part of the discussion came out from, you know, we were working very closely with Meles Zenawi, Prime Minister of Ethiopia, who sadly lost him in 2012. But going back to when those banks were being discussed, and China, of course, very much involved in both of them, Meles, as a borrower in Ethiopia, was saying, look, I do borrow from China because it's cheap, but borrowing from China is complicated. It's not as if there are no conditions attached to all this. And he said, if there was more partnership between the development banks and China, then there would be an increase in transparency all round. It would make us much easier as an African country to negotiate with China and do things in a more open way. And so he was working exactly on this issue of combining Chinese money with international development money. And he felt that they needed 2 new banks, or at least 1 new bank, in order to facilitate that process. In other words, the existing banks weren't making it very easy. So we worked together and then helped get those things off the ground. So I'm giving that example to show that these kinds of flexibilities and creativities are possible, but they need openness, they need the willingness to walk arm in arm to tackle things together. And we should not assume that's absent in China.
Can I make a couple of
Please do.
points on
Yeah,
that? Sorry. You know, just on this issue of debt and China's role in debt, I mean, I think we should also, you know, be aware and have a little understanding. This is kind of a new position for China to be in.
Yeah.
It's really brand new, and they're sort of feeling their way through it. And as you say, they're incredibly pragmatic and trying to figure out a solution. We'll often work it out in an ad hoc way, country by country.
Yeah.
And maybe it will evolve towards a more systematic approach. Hopefully it will, and hopefully with more engagement with the Paris Club and all the rest. But you know, it's not like they're being evil. It's they're trying to figure out what role are they playing in this system. And to make another point about their engagement with the MDBs, I mean, the whole issue of the shareholding is, of course, pretty well known. I mean, they have 6% of the World Bank, and I think 6 of the 7 G7 countries, excluding the United States, have a combined 25% voting share. And China's economy is bigger than all of them put together. You know, so China looks at that and says, you know, this is a bit ridiculous. And China, you know, in the past, you know, they have these co-financing funds at IFC. They put in like 2 billion, or actually, I think they have 4 billion now at the IFC. African Development Bank, 2 billion. Inter-American Development Bank, another 2 billion. And you know, why do they have those co-financing funds? Because China has been trying to increase the capital of these banks for years. They even went to a couple of these banks and said, look, can we include it as capital and not even get any voting share for it? Because the People's Bank of China had a lot of money and wanted to, you know, invest in these banks because they see them as useful. And they got shut out by the non-borrower shareholders, basically the United States most of all. And so they have these co-financing funds, which are not bad, but they're not leveraged. It's just a one-to-one thing. It could be so much more powerful. So, you know, when China looks at that, it's no surprise they want to create 2 new banks.
That's why these third windows could be very valuable, because some of them exist already. The global infrastructure fund and the facility, the climate investment funds, and the environment funds. If we could change those and enhance them in a way that they could leverage much more, then it's a terrible word now since George W. Bush, but you could have a coalition of the willing who were ready to go into those funds, and it's uncomplicated or much less complicated by the overall voting shares in the basic IBRD.
I want to come back to the overall issue of climate and the mission of the World Bank, because when we at The Economist talk to some people around the world, they say, look, the West is increasingly concerned with climate lending, climate finance lending. We're worried this is going to crowd out the development that we really need, which is not always completely consistent with reducing climate change, in the sense that as people get richer, they fly more, they eat more meat, they emit more carbon. So is there a tension between a climate mission and a development mission? And I think having raised that,
Well, I have to say, we spent this afternoon at the symposium at closed door, and we debated on this quite a lot. I'm probably not the best person to talk about this. We thought, and I kind of stress a line, we shouldn't be talking about a trade-off right now between climate and development. We thought we were kind of over to a certain extent. I mean, I can add my own experience when we were talking to client countries and we asked them about what they would like the MDBs to prioritize. I mean, climate mitigation and development didn't come up on the kind of top list. There might have been health, education, energy.
It didn't come up.
Didn't come up. So, but we need to kind of ask why. I mean, that's the kind of key question. I mean, climate change mitigation and development was a priority, but not as high as others. It's probably kind of a different view and the way we frame as well the kind of issue. I mean, if you're kind of specifying this as a kind of, if you kind of invest in a kind of a low, carbon economy, if you kind of invest in building resilience, you will have also a more stable growth path. You will kind of manage shocks better, and it will have in turn kind of an impact on your kind of development trajectory. I think to a certain extent, it's not often that clear, that kind of trajectory, the kind of costs and the benefits. We know that the costs are changing all the time in a kind of exponential way, and also the benefits of a low carbon transition are increasingly over time. And I think that kind of different narrative and storyline sometimes is not what, if I can say, development partners or MDBs are really telling the client countries. And again, it's also an agenda that is not about middle-income countries, but also for low-income countries.
I've been bashing.
This is Nick's special subject. I'm just telling you.
Yes.
I've been bashing away at this for more than a decade. About a decade ago, we created the Global Commission on Economy and Climate, and the new climate economy being its big topic. And we. Our first publication was called Better Growth, Better Climate. And that came out ahead of Paris. And the debate started to change. We would not have got Paris if the developing world thought that there was just a straight horse race or a spitting contest between climate on the one hand and development on the other. I'm pleased that The Economist talks to people around the world. Some of us has been doing that for a very long time, Henry. But
You had a bit of a head start.
Yeah, but this narrative is about sustainable, resilient, and inclusive development. And you can model it, but actually it's deeper than most of the models because there's so much innovation, learning by doing, increasing returns to scale, which doesn't normally come into the models that economists are capable of handling in any formal sense. But if you watch the way in which those processes have played through, it's now true that the clean is cheaper than the dirty across around a third of the emissions. You can look at the publication, the Paris effects from Systemic, full openness. I chair the board of Systemic, but that's where those numbers are. Probably in 7 or 8 years, we will see that statement being true, that the clean's cheaper than the dirty, probably with around 2/3 of the emissions. Basically, electric power generation, it's true now, and transport is pretty close. Arguably, it's there already, but it would be. The green steel is not far away. Probably in 2 or 3 years, we'll see green hydrogen about $1 a kg or 1.5. When it gets down to those levels, green steel is in the money. So if you think of those kinds, if you think of it from the point of view of technology, if you think about it from the point of view of examples, mangroves, they capture carbon in a fantastically powerful way. They give you the resilience against storm surges. They're very good for fish and biodiversity, and actually for tigers as well, if you like your tigers. If you think of public transport, that is development, mitigation, resilience. If you think of restoring degraded land, development, mitigation, resilience. If you think of decentralized solar, development, mitigation, resilience, right across the board. I gave you the examples of the technologies across emissions. Take the examples that I've just given you, and then basically think of the fundamentals of the process. A lot of this is about efficiency. Efficiency is productivity, is growth. A lot of this is about investing where it's cheaper. I've already described it. And big bulk of this is already cheaper and a lot more on the way. It's about investing where there's economies of scale, where the innovation is powerful. It's about investing in ways where you don't kill people. I mean, we kill people through air pollution, 5 or 10 million a year, but about a bit over 50 million die each year. So you look at it from the point of view of technology, you look at it from the point of view of examples, you look at it from the point of view of the processes of development, there ain't no horse race there. The challenge now is to bring the projects and the programs and the finance to the table so that Africa can invest in solar. Solar beats out the fossil fuels for electricity on on 6 or 7. This is fundamental. You've got to understand this. It beats out fossil fuels for electricity at 6-7% at cost of capital. It does not at the 15 or 20% cost of capital it has to pay, and that's where the MDBs are so important.
So if someone comes to an MDB with a natural gas project, which they say we want to develop in order to boost our economic growth, should they say no, Manoush?
Should the MDB say no?
Yeah, should they say no, this is not consistent with net zero?
I mean,
It's about the transition.
yeah, I think it's,
It could be consistent with some transitions to net zero. in
it
some
depends, the
circumstances.
answer.
But it needs to be consistent.
Yeah, I mean, Cole, it's hard to say, it's hard to justify, say, looking for new fossil fuel reserves today, because that is inconsistent with the transition.
Don't you then land?
Gas is more complicated.
Don't you then land in a world where a poorer country can say you're not financing our development, while the West continues to burn fossil fuels at greater rates than we do? Isn't there an ethical issue that comes?
I mean, if we're going to tell the MDBs you can't lend for natural gas, much less coal, which, obviously I think you should be in certain transition cases, you can make the justification. But whatever decision the MDBs make or the shareholders make for the MDBs about what they should lend for and what they shouldn't, well, then we have to offer alternatives.
Exactly.
We have to offer a package
Exactly.
that's attractive to them.
Absolutely.
And that's not, it's about the financing, it's about the project preparation, helping them design, and not just designing a project, but designing a whole program for how you're going to reform your energy grid.
Yeah.
That's not based on one solar facility or plant.
Yeah.
And the countries need help on this.
It's about the
And the
transition.
MDBs are the MDBs are super well positioned
Yeah.
to do this because they know how they have the convening power. They can bring together the regulators. They can bring together the government officials, the private sector actors who might then invest so we can structure the bonds the right way. All of these things, the MDBs are very well positioned to do.
And you need to be in a kind of, Chris, you said correctly, you need a kind of a broader strategy and holistic one. At the same time, it's not gas, yes or no, it's about not locking in into a kind of a technology that might be obsolete in the next 10 to 20 years. So going back to the point again, I don't want to. I wasn't a kind of great fan of the CCDRs. Now I'm becoming. You need to kind of build on a kind of a longer term strategy, and then you need them to fit the type of kind of energy that you want to plug in. But again, not to lock into a kind of a technology that might be obsolete in 5 or 10 years and even be more expensive.
It's a mistake to just treat it as taxonomy, as either fish or fowl.
Exactly.
This is about a transition process, and is it consistent with a transition process that is compatible with 1.5 degrees? Net zero is just an endpoint, right? It's a fundamental and critical endpoint, but it's about the transition in a way that manages world emissions so that we can hold to 1.5, or we're going to overshoot in a longer term way. And that's what I worry about, the language of taxonomy, which you often hear, or the way you pose the question, is it's either fish or fowl. This is a transition process, and supporting countries in the transition process. And as Chris was saying, bringing the finance, affordable finance, risk managed finance to the table so that these better ways of doing things are actually affordable.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go to the audience for questions. Do you want to make one final comment while the audience
just to underscore the point of
think of their questions?
The narrative is so fundamental, and I think it's also for everyone who works in this space, because some of these trade-offs are being almost artificially created, and there is a development camp and a climate camp, and that is very unhelpful. So reframing those narratives is really fundamental. And yes, being less hypocritical in the West, that would help too, because obviously, all low and middle income countries are looking at what we're doing and pointing the finger. So that advocacy that is so vibrant needs to be even stronger in our own societies.
It really expresses a lack of trust. The lower income countries, they hear climate change and they think this is just another scam to hold us down or to not give us what they want. And we need to find other ways to present it where it doesn't,
Yeah, rich country behavior over this last, well, over a long period, but over this last 5 or 10 years, particularly around the pandemic, particularly around the consequences of the war, not coming up with 100 billion agreed at Copenhagen and through to Cancun and Paris. The rich world has really undermined those relationships in a way that makes everything much more difficult.
Okay, it's time now for you to pose your questions to the panel. I'm going to take these in groups of 3. We have people watching online as well. So we'll do the room, one set from the room, and then we'll see if people have questions online on YouTube, I believe. Please try to keep your questions short and ideally have them end with a question mark. That will make it a lot easier for us to collect them and answer them in batches. So yeah. Are there any questions in the room who wants to kick us off? Yes, I think that was the first hand up. Okay. Yes, yeah, I think so.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much. This has been super interesting. So my question is more around the issue of conditionalities, which I think they increase this complexity around to financing. And I'm thinking specifically about the actual initiatives. So what future do you see for these sorts of conditionality? And do you think they're going to be helpful? And if yes, which kind of conditionality, like more financial and monetary reform, or something more directed to poverty reduction strategies? What do you think about this?
Okay, let's collect some more. I think there was one over here. Yes.
Thank you so much for the discussion. I guess the weak link in the development is the change in the interest rates, and that was the case during the Latin American debt crisis, and it is now a sort of like a repeat of that agenda. So, is there any mechanism that can mitigate countries from change in the interest rates?
Okay, and one more. I think there's one in the middle. Yes, the man in the grey jacket. Thank you. Just about. I want to speak up a little. Oh no, I think your mic's still on. There you go.
So back to the question about reform of the multilateral development, which I take to be mostly speaking and they explain that. All good, we have the investment windows. But do we not actually therefore need to dismantle this private governance of those, all the DIBRD big institutions to actually ensure that they actually can provide second party mobilizing money, which today we do not do. And so we need to focus on that. And if other organizations around the world, I think there's some other interests that the choose. So but actually the Department of events.
Okay, so what future do you see for conditionality? Was the first question there, and who wants to? Evidently a hard one.
That's the last one about the use of the facts, which is kind of probably dodge the most difficult part on this. I mean, in the kind of client survey kind of mentioned, we also trying to kind of turn this stone, and we asked government officials what they thought about policy conditionality. In particular, again, it's a survey, so there are some naive questions that we cannot probe. But we asked them whether policy conditionality affects the decision about borrowing from MDBs. I mean, 4 out of 5 said the policy conditionality is a kind of a factor that really kind of affects their decision about borrowing from MDBs, and 49%, so nearly half of them actually said policy conditions affect the decision a lot. So policy conditionality is there. We don't talk a lot about it, and that's something to a certain extent relatively interesting to me. And very interesting. We were talking about climate and development, bringing kind of a holistic approach, a kind of a broader strategy. And you would expect a type of financing instruments like the development policy finance. It's like budget support to be the preferred kind of option, because you can build kind of strategies, you can build programs. And actually countries to dodge policy conditionality, they opt to kind of work on project finance. This is actually going against what we just kind of discussed. So I might not have a kind of a solution, but certainly a kind of a reducing the kind of weight on policy conditions and be very targeted. You kind of raised a kind of a really good question. To me, is a key discussion now overlooked in all the reform agenda of the World Bank. I hope it will be tackled in the next kind of stage that should be there actually to increase the uptake from client countries.
Can I just add? I think that also, in a way, goes back to this level of trust and how it's been undermined, because policy conditionality is often seen as a way to beat poorer countries with a stick that they don't always understand. And I think there is need for a much deeper dialogue around what conditionality and why, and in a way sort of making sure that borrowers fully understand and in many ways shape some of those policy conditions as well. That has not been the case so far, and I think there is a lot of a kind of reaction to, I think they do understand some, but others they feel is an imposition that they don't particularly sign up to.
Yeah, I've probably had more than my fair share of airtime, so I'll pass on the other two questions. But just on conditionality, I mean, take the example of procurement. That's a very important part of a project working well. It's a very important part of tackling corruption. Or take the example of a structure to give some sort of confidence in the revenue flows into an electricity supply project of some kind. Those are conditionalities which are around making the project work well, and in an environment where often governments are under pressure, to allocate to friends or to give electricity away free at the time of elections and so on. So often it helps with those within the government who are trying to do things well. So it's not, I think, at least it should not be some kind of nasty bossy conspiracy to tell everybody to behave in the way you want them to behave. It's actually around projects and programs delivering well. And as was just said, it is, that kind of thing works much better if there's a good working relationship at the country level between the MDB and the local people, the local government, other people, private sector, taking those decisions. But
okay.
I will pass on the other two.
Okay, so Manoush, interest rates, and that's the weak link in development, it was said. So what can we do about that?
Yeah, so the problem when you're a developing country is that you don't borrow in your own currency. And whereas if you're a rich country, you get to borrow in your own currency because people want to hold your currency. And why is that the fundamental problem? Well, because one of the laws of economics is that all countries treat positive shocks as permanent and negative shocks as temporary. And so in the good times, they borrow a lot and they assume that it's going to be low forever, low interest rates forever. And then when interest rates rise, and in every Fed tightening cycle, when the Fed raises rates, we have a debt crisis. It's happened throughout economic history. And so the question you asked really is, what's the solution to this and how do you mitigate it? Some people have argued that developing countries should have access to swap lines, which is what rich countries have. When they have a crisis, they can access swap lines through central banks. Realistically, I don't think that's going to happen because central banks have national mandates, not international mandates. And so the idea that the Fed is going to lend to Brazil and give it access to dollar swap lines in a moment of crisis, the Fed will say, it's not my job to take care of Brazil. My job is to worry about the US economy, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think that's a realistic solution. A much more practical solution is to develop domestic capital markets so that you can borrow in your own currency domestically. So that's one way of mitigating that risk. And of course, the second way is to not not drink too much punch in the good times, right? Yes, and to have debt levels that are sustainable. At the moment, we have debt levels for many emerging markets that are at levels that are really unprecedented. And people deluded themselves that it's, oh, this is very serviceable because interest rates are so low and they're going to stay low forever. One argument that's being made often is that rather than think of debt to GDP ratios as your kind of measure of sustainability, is to look at debt servicing to GDP and to kind of stress test that. So I think that's another thing that countries should be doing is stressing their debt sustainability under a range of interest rate scenarios so that they don't get themselves in a situation where it becomes unsustainable.
Okay, thank you. And the third question was, how do we ensure concessional financing happens? Sarah, I don't know if you want to know.
I think that's more for Chris.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not, I didn't quite fully understand the question. It was about sort of needing to dismantle IBRD governance to get more concessional resource. I didn't quite follow the connection, if I'm completely honest. I mean, IBRD is obviously the non-concessional lending window, which I'm sure the questioner knows. But just to make the point, I mean, IBRD financially has been rather effective over the last 80 years, just in purely financial terms, such to the point where it's actually paid for a lot of IDA. They've taken net income from IBRD and given it to IDA, and it's a lot of money, something like 13 billion over the years. I mean, that would be a massive capital increase for IBRD if they had kept it themselves. So it's actually been rather effective that way. But the broader question is, how do we get more concessional resources? And, I mean,
there's a nice paper called The Simple Maths of Development Finance, which is a CGD paper. It goes through the maths of IBRD and it shows you how concessional it is relative to market rates for all emerging markets and developing countries. So it is actually pretty.
I mean, the policy rate of IBRD is fantastic. I mean, they're never going to get that kind of money anywhere else. Yeah. But it still might be, for the lowest income countries that are under a high debt to stress, it still might be too much. And there we need concessional resources that are zero interest loans or actually grants, depending. And where that money comes from, I mean, there's no magic bullets. IDA now has got a bond rating, so it can actually issue bonds and borrow at market rates like IBRD. That's nice, but after you're basically just kind of turning it into another IRT over the long run. And this money has to come from the pockets of wealthy governments. There's no other way to get around.
Taxpayer has to pay.
And it's very difficult to do, and we can set up all sorts of complicated smoke and mirrors, but at the end of the day, that's where concessional resources are going to come.
I think you're going to find in the Paris, I'm quite deeply involved in the Paris discussions for next month. And one of the issues that has been raised is new sources of tax revenue. It is tax revenue, it comes from somewhere. Yeah, but there are, one of them will be shipping. And that would be a potential source, which is very little taxed at the minute, which you could possibly find agreement on. The voluntary carbon markets are flows of finance which do not involve any debt service. The philanthropies, of course, they're limited, but they still can be important, particularly if you organize various facilities for offering guarantees on the basis of some basic money in there. The SDRs are another source that they're not cost-free, of course, but there are various sources which can play roles like that. I would like to stress the importance of increasing ODA, and I would stress the importance of increasing ODA, but I don't think any of us here are sufficiently naive to think that there's a lot of that that's about to appear, particularly since so much of the support for Ukraine, which is, I don't mean the military support, but so much of the non-military support for Ukraine, which is of fundamental importance, has come out of ODA money, which has meant that the poor countries of Africa have been those who have paid in large measure for the vital support for, I say, non-military for Ukraine. And that seems to me to be fundamentally immoral. I mean, we should have stepped up ourselves to that and
I mean,
not
that
taking.
will change next year because that rules only allow for the refugee part, to use those resources for the first year of the crisis. So a little bit of that will go back, but obviously there are still important flows of ODA into Ukraine.
Also, just to very quickly connect to the China point from earlier, I mean, China has somewhat increased its contribution to IDA, but it's still a relatively low contributor to IDA. And obviously it's, it's got the money. It could do a lot more. But that gets back to these governance issues. It doesn't feel like it's really part of this cooperative institutions in a way that makes it want to give a lot of its resources. So, a lot of it does come back to governance.
We could build concessionary windows at AIB and NDB. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they have only a sort of a project preparation.
It's a special fund. I mean, first come, first serve. But I think this kind of question around concessional finance is actually at the core of all the kind of reform discussion and the kind of perceived trade-off between development and climate. I mean, first of all, I like, Chris, you reiterated the point. I mean, concessionality is often even a relative kind of concept. I mean, it's always kind of better than market terms. I know that the ODA has certain kind of rules, but it's still kind of better than market terms. And of course, I mean, how can we expand this? I mean, to a certain extent, we know that bilateral development cooperation budgets are feeling the strain at the moment, but the share that was going to multilateral organizations was bigger in the past. I mean, I wouldn't be here to talk about multilateral development banks. I think it's one of the most effective ways actually to invest a relatively limited amount of money. But we know that it's kind of receding. I mean, the UK is moving away, for example, used to be more than 50%, now it's 25% to the multilateral side. So it's also a reallocation of resources. And then Nick talked about a different kind of number, I mean, alternative sources. There are also philanthropic organizations that are stepping up their efforts when it comes to the vertical health fund. So that could release resources towards the multilateral development banks and other institutions. Again, we would like to expand the pie, but there are different ways where we can use public finance in a different way in multilateral development banks.
Okay. 20 billion of paid in capital into the IBRD has led to 800 billion of loans. It is fantastic value for money, way beyond what any individual country could do. And the more we can get across to, and Manoush and I have worked in public, in the civil service here. I was 3 years in the Her Majesty's Treasury. Value for money was the first question, and rightly so. This is amazing value for money, far beyond what an individual country could get. So we have to make the case to the treasurers of the world that if they want big value for money, that's the way to go.
I'm going to compare that. Sorry, you compare that 20 billion.
We really have to let more people ask questions. Okay, let's move to a question from YouTube, which is the median sovereign risk rating of low-income countries and middle-income countries is B-, which is outside the mandate of most investors. Yet 98% of MDB and DFI commitments do not de-risk. How should MDBs de-risk? Nick?
You have to start with the project itself. There's the riskiness in the project, and there's the management of the risk in the finance of the project. So if you're building an electric supply thing that goes into the grid, will the grid be of a kind that can take the money? Will the people who are purchasing that electricity be in a position to pay? If you want to get permission to use land, will you get that permission? There's a whole range of practicalities around getting it done and around the cash flows and around the costs, where a good MDB can work with the private sector and the country to really bring down that risk.
I mean, I would just add, I think it's important to focus first and foremost on sovereign risk.
Exactly.
Because, and the best way to improve your credit rating if you're a sovereign is to have really good policies. It's really hard, and I used to run the World Bank Guarantee Program. It is almost impossible to have a project have a risk rating that is better than the sovereign.
Yep.
It's very hard, very rare. The only way you can do that is if you're an oil exporter and your creditors can get a guarantee that they can get all the revenues from your oil for X number of years. Those kind of very extreme guarantees, which are very difficult to do. So for me, I think the best way to get a better risk rating is to improve your policies and get a better sovereign rating, because that just lifts everything up.
But you've got to take it all the way through. There's the sovereign, there's the project and the program, and then there's how the risk is managed and shared within the financing arrangements. But if you ask why somebody has to pay 15-20% to borrow on a solar project in a less than B rated country in Africa or elsewhere, the big part of the story is the sovereign risk. But there's a big lot of risk in the project itself as well. And then you've got the whole financing side of who shares what when through the financial structure.
I think can I just add, I think on the country risk is really important to get better analytics, because I think a lot of the country risk, it's not always very thoroughly assessed. There's a lot of knowledge, deep knowledge of countries is not there. And I think there's a big educational piece to be done with the credit rating agencies that I think collectively a lot of us could do, to help assess that risk in a slightly different way. And that is, a big discussion that is taking place within, in the context of the reform of the MDBs. And there's also an element of how you assess the risk, and as I was saying before, in terms of the parameters across a number of MDBs, and how that risk is, assessed, what kind of risk sharing you can do as well in terms of different MDBs working together.
You can't take on country risk without the IMF really being involved in the story.
I'm going to take one more question from online and then give the final word to the room, because we're coming towards the end. The next question from online is, how do we use the analysis mentioned to link to action and impact? What incentive and process changes are needed? And how do you implement the accountability that's necessary to monitor progress? Sarah?
Yeah, I can come back to that. I mean, again, it's a lot of examples. Some of the regional development banks are actually experimenting with, creating better incentive that starts from how you assess your managers, what the performance appraisals actually of managers are, and how you are incentivizing the ability to take risk or to simplify procedures. Ultimately, it really comes to that, which is quite basic. Other aspects are how you assess those procedures as being fundamental to projects, the way they're designed, the way they're assessed. A lot of it I think it's the risk that senior managers fear, as I was saying before, in terms of their own performance and holding back. It's not rocket science. What we do in a lot of organizations is really simplifying a lot of those processes and procedures to make sure that countries, as you were saying before, can borrow, can sort of develop pipelines that are easier to manage and engage in. I'm not sure what level of detail you want to go in.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to do one more round of questions from the room. Please do keep them brief, or you're now in the territory of delaying the reception. So yes, I think the first hand up there was just behind the man in the jumper. Yes.
For me?
Yes.
Good, thank you very much. So,
oh yeah, wait for the mic, please.
Yes, thank you. Okay. In the discussion tonight talks about reforms for mandates, governance, and financing. Now, there's been a lot of talk about governance, but it's mainly on how to make an MDB work more effectively, and that's been quite interesting. But we've been talking about stuff like this for years and years and years, and I don't actually see a lot of progress. There is a big problem. The massive problem is standards of governance in beneficiary countries, recipient countries, so that if programs or structural adjustment, or however you want to describe it, whether it's borrowing from the fund or borrowing from the bank or ancillary organizations, they don't make any progress. And I mean, Nick made the point that he's still waiting for 100 billion from Copenhagen or something like this. It's because people pledge and they just don't deliver. And there is the main problem for me is that in so many countries, the corruption or maladministration just puts an end to any sort of progress, and you never really achieve the goals of the program and the project. Now, unless that is tackled, it doesn't really matter whether we can increase financing in clever ways or other ways, or general capital increases. You're not going to get anywhere. And the point is, we're running out of time. People have mentioned urgency. We really need urgency. We've got till about 2030. So I would just lay that one down for you to think about. Who's going to do it? I think the IFIs do it. I think the bank and the fund, that should be their major task. Stop doing all these projects and programs and sector studies and that sort of thing. They're not going to get anywhere until the governance gets sorted. Thank you.
Okay. There was the next one. There was someone immediately in front who was also quite keen, and then I'll go at the back, and that'll be the last one over there. Sorry to everyone else.
Thank you very much. I'm with Publish What You Fund. We're the global campaign for aid and development finance transparency. We produced the DFI, the Development Finance Institution Transparency Index earlier this year. The three main findings were that where MDBs really fall down is on impact and being transparent about their impact of these investments, on private capital mobilization, which we've talked about and which people are expecting to be a new source of revenue, and also on accountability to communities. That's where they're worst in terms of transparency, in terms of what we can see. Our ODI colleagues know this because they've got researchers working on these issues and struggling to find this data. So my question is, these reforms are about not just more finance, which we talked a lot about, but they're about better finance. Are you, as panelists, confident that within the next couple of years, it does look like we're going to get more finance? Are we going to get better finance? And are we going to know when we get there?
Okay, and the last one.
Hi, my question was about synthetic securitization and schemes like Room to Run and the extension of those schemes and how they could possibly lead to extending MDB balance sheets.
Okay. So the first one there is, who is going to do it? Don't standards of governance in beneficiary countries hold things back? Would anyone like to comment on that? Sarah?
So we do a lot of work on corruption and transparency, as someone has said as well. And yes, absolutely, it's definitely an issue to be taken into account. I also think that sometimes it's overblown. It's not everywhere. There is really the fundamental issues. Is also how we analyze the politics of a country and what we deem to be corruption or not corruption. I see behaviors that are very similar in rich countries as well, but we just don't call corruption. We define in a different way. This networking, or is, I don't know, some sort of not lobbying exactly. And I think it's how we engage with countries, trusting more of their own sort of the ownership of their processes in a way that is not always so judgmental. Having said that, yes, of course, there is, diversion, leakage of resources. I don't think it's really the fundamental problem. That's my personal.
Okay, the next one was we need not just more finance, but better finance. Will we get it? How optimistic are you, Manoush?
It's interesting. I mean, you mentioned the accountability, the issues around transparency and accountability, impact, and local communities, and those issues have been around for a very long time in terms of criticisms of the MDBs. And in a weird way, one of my worries is that because everyone knows the MDBs need more resources to deliver on all the important issues that we've been talking about, that creates an environment in which candor about failures is very difficult. Because if we say this project failed or that one didn't deliver the impact we were hoping for, then you don't get the capital increase that you need. You don't get the balance sheet innovations that you're trying to persuade shareholders to agree on, et cetera, et cetera. So that worries me. And that is in the nature of modern politics in a social media age where when was the last time you heard a politician admit they made a mistake, right? So I don't you know, I don't know how to answer that question, given the context that we're all operating in. I would say we have made some progress on transparency. You know, when I first started working at the World Bank, every document was labeled confidential or secret. And when I was a student, if you could get your whole hands on a World Bank report that had data in it, it was a gold mine. It was like this, you know, and to be fair, now everything is published and it's on the website, and they actually provide the raw data for researchers online. And so we have, you know, it is important to acknowledge that the level of progress on transparency is enormous for those of us who are old enough to remember how it used to be. But on impact and effectiveness and accountability, I think it's very problematic given the political context in which they operate.
Okay, thank you. And the final question was about synthetic securitization and its potential. Chris, would you like to answer that one?
Yeah, sure. It's a rather specific topic to end on. But just to make a comment on that governance point before, I mean, I would just caution about making really blanket statements that's all just horribly corrupt and nothing works. I mean, because that hides some of the really good cases that are out there. And that's also, you know, why development is so hard. Because it's inherent in what we're trying to do is dealing with countries that are facing difficulties, and we're trying to help them get better. So, and I wouldn't say it's all up to the IFIs to fix it, because yeah, that's, you know, a new version of colonialism in some way. I understand the issue, and it's a serious problem. There's no question. But in terms of synthetic securitization, basically what this was the African Development Bank has a whole bunch of loans on its books that it's already made, and it found a way to shift the risk of those loans off to an external party, basically an investor, as a way to then clear more space so we can do more lending at the end of the day. And the African Development Bank kept the loans and is still responsible for them. But in case they don't get repaid, that other investor will pay the African Development Bank back. That's basically what that's about. Super innovative technique, but it raises a lot of other issues as well. I mean, just to say it, this idea of transferring risk off MDB balance sheets is an interesting one that we need to explore. It's a new technique it helps develop markets for, you know, assets in emerging markets. There's a lot of potential benefits. The reason, let's be honest, why the African Development Bank has been so innovative on these issues is it can't get capital from its shareholders. It doesn't have the money, and it needs to deal with the realities of the development challenges that Africa is facing. And so, you know, out of desperation, is the mother of invention, right? It came up with some very creative techniques that have been quite successful. But we do need to keep in mind also, especially when we're talking about loans to governments, sovereign loans, that there are trade-offs involved here, and we need to be cautious about that. There are a lot of techniques out there for mobilizing private investment using the balance sheet of MDBs. And I think it's fantastic for the non-sovereign lending entities, IFC, IDB Invest, EBRD to a degree. But we do need to be a little bit more cautious with this cooperative, these MDB, because that's what they are, the cooperative banks formed by governments to face challenges and to do a better job than they can do by themselves. And that's a very valuable model that we need to protect.
Henry, can we not end on a note of negativity? Because up to COVID, think what happened in the world over the 50, 60, 70 preceding years. You know, life expectancy went up, primarily in developing countries, by 20 or 30 years. You know, living standards went up, poverty went down. The number of kids at school and to some extent how they performed went up remarkably. So the idea that nothing can be done is just straight factually wrong. And a great deal has been done. And to some extent, this is mainly countries themselves making things happen, but to some extent, the international institutions did play a role in that story. And can we increase quickly and with better quality? Well, to coin a phrase, yes, we can. The question is, will we? And it's up to us and all those involved with the MDBs to try to translate what's possible into what will happen.
Okay, a nice uplifting note on which to end. We've had a really wide-ranging discussion there. We covered fragility, China, climate, even synthetic securitization. I'm told the recording will be online soon. Thank you to everyone who watched live online. I mean, the reception's just outside. Sorry. Thank you.
Please thank, I did thank.
More worried about.
Yeah.
Making.